Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're slowly letting people in this evening. We're not quite where we're supposed to be. So, okay, we're ticking up a little bit. If this is your first time here, I always ask, please let us know where you're tuning in from. I am in East Hartford. Jeffrey is in Hartford and Jonathan is in Chicago. But we would love to hear where you all are from. Perhaps what brought you here tonight. We're still waiting for a few more people. So yeah. Okay, it looks like we have someone from Barkhamsted in Connecticut. Yeah, let us know if you have any thoughts, any memories about Martin Luther King Jr., anything. Yeah, I obviously was born after he died. But so a lot of my memories come from things that were taught in school or documentaries or movies that I've seen. But yeah, let us know what you're thinking. And while you are gathering all your thoughts, I will just go ahead and start my introduction. Hi, I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. Thank you for joining us for this virtual program for King, a Life. First, I want to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. And we are also incredibly grateful to the Wishuo Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. Also, please consider supporting our museum by becoming a member. All members receive free admission to our author programs, free admission to the house and museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and more. And I'll put a link in the chat so you can take a look at that whenever you're able. Now on to our guests. Our author, Jonathan Eig, is a former senior writer for the Wall Street Journal. He's the New York Times bestselling author of several books, including Ali, A Life, Luckiest Man, The Life and Death of Lou Gehrig, and Opening Day, the story of Jackie Robinson's first season. Ken Burns calls him a master storyteller, and Eig's books have been listed among the best of the year by the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Sports Illustrated, and Slate. Our moderator, Dr. Jeffrey O.G. Akbar, has taught at the University of Connecticut's Department of History since 1997. In 2014, he became founding director of the Center for the Study of Popular Music. He has held fellowships at Harvard University's W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and the Africana Studies program at the University of Miami. He has published Hip Hop Revolution, The Culture and Politics of Rap, and Black Power, Radical Politics and African American Identity, among others. Now, we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat while Jonathan and Jeffrey are having their conversation. If you have any specific questions, if you could just put those into the Q&A section so they don't get lost in the chat. Please also know that you could click on captions, and I'm actually going to turn those on as well to see live auto captioning for this program. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I'll be putting a link in the chat to purchase King, a Life through our museum store. Your purchase will support our museum and our honored guest. So yes, please sit back and enjoy this program. I'll turn this over to you, Jonathan and Jeffrey.
Thank you very much, Omar. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I am excited to have this conversation with Jonathan about this remarkable book. And I am very familiar with Dr. King in so many ways, and the book was so very illuminating. There were so many twists and turns in the narrative of his life, but I think in our conversation tonight, I hope to talk about some things that are novel for a lot of people, even people who are specialists, because you give a lot of attention to the characters that helped shape King, including not just his wife, Greta Scott King, but also the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover. Um, I'll say a couple quick remarks, something that many of us are familiar with when we think of King and the gravity of King's impact. We have seen many polls over the last 20 years. Many studies have looked at the most prominent and admired speeches of most prominent Americans of the 20th century. You know where I'm going with this. Dr. King is always in the top 10, right? The I Have a Dream speech is like the Gettysburg Address is one of the most admired speeches by any American. And it is iconic in all sorts of ways, highlighting the possibilities of America and beyond that, the possibilities of humanity. So we have this person who is a product of American soil who becomes an illuminating figure for the global stage, the possibilities of the human spirit to transcend moral shortcomings, ethical shortcomings, and vast human rights abuses to become more civilized, more humane, more just. And this sort of beacon of light in many ways for people beyond the swampy, musty grasslands of backwoods Mississippi, right? And something much bigger than that. But in 1966, as you know, polls have shown that most Americans did not like Dr. King, did not admire Dr. King, and he fell from the list of the most admired Americans. And at no point, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but of all the Gallup polls, at no point did the majority of white Americans ever see him in a favorable light. So Dr. King himself has been, in some ways, sort of rejuvenated as a figure, or perhaps the people themselves have moved closer to sort of the values and principles that King had fought for so long. And it's exciting to see the sort of changes and shifts that have occurred in the 54 years since King's now 55 years since King's assassination. So the first thing is, when we think about King's life, most Americans are aware of King. Most Americans see King as a positive figure. King, as you explore here, is much more complicated. King is much more nuanced, and he's opposed by more forces than people generally think of. Can you give us a discussion about the arc of King's life, but if we could start with the sort of the connection to Connecticut, and then we'll get into the conversation about, since we're here virtually in Connecticut, I know you're virtually here in Chicago, but can you discuss a little bit about how Connecticut helped shape the arc of King's life and what he thought about the possibilities of America? And if there's something there about his visit to Suffield, was it Suffield?
Simsbury.
Simsbury, thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, Jeffrey, thanks for that introduction, and I'm excited to talk to you tonight. It's going to be fun. Let's start with Simsbury, because it really helps you understand where King is coming from and where he's going. He is 16 years old. He's about to enroll at Morehouse. He doesn't actually know yet if he's been accepted. But even though he hasn't been accepted yet, he's eligible for this program that allows Morehouse students to travel to Simsbury, work as tobacco farmers for the summer, and have their transportation paid for by the tobacco company if they finish the summer, if they last the entire summer, and they can make some money that during the summer that they can put toward their tuition. And this is King's first time traveling outside the South. He's born and raised in Atlanta, of course. His father and grandparents come from a little town just 20 miles outside Atlanta. So he's been exposed to Jim Crow. He knows it like the back of his hand. He knows where he can and can't go and be treated respectfully in Atlanta. But when he takes the train from Atlanta to the north and they get to Washington, D.C., the conditions change. He's allowed to leave the black car, the car that's reserved for what they call colored at the time. He's allowed to leave that car and sit anywhere he wants on the train. And he gets to Connecticut and he sees that he can go into town and go to the movie theater and sit wherever he wants. He can go into most restaurants, without getting even a second look. And he writes these letters home to his parents as if, he's landed on a new planet. He's discovering and exploring this stuff for the first time. He's also living away from home for the first time and really discovering who he wants to be. He's not very interested in tobacco farming. He describes himself as, one of the laziest tobacco farmers. He and his pal like to find a shady spot and see how long they can go without being made to get back to work. But he also shows some ambition. He volunteers to work in the kitchen so he gets more food that way. And he volunteers to preach to his fellow students. And this is very interesting because up until that point, ML, as everybody calls him, or Little Mike, he's not yet known as Martin. Little Mike is telling his dad he does not want to be a preacher. He does not want to follow in his father's footsteps. He wants to be a doctor or a lawyer. And this is and yet he's volunteering to be the preacher for the other farmers who are working in Simsbury. And it really sends a message home to his parents that, hey, maybe the lessons we've been drilling into his head about preaching are starting to sink in. So it's really a formative time for young ML King.
So something that I did not mention, and anyone who knows Morehouse Man knows that we are very conspicuous about our alma mater and our adoration for alma mater. And you see in the first third of the book just how important Morehouse is to shaping Dr. King. And King is shaped by Howard Thurman, the valedictorian of our class of 23, who becomes this dean of the Boston University theological seminary or so. And he also is shaped by Benjamin Elijah Mays, one of our presidents. And he's the most consequential president at Morehouse College. And he actually thinks that he might follow in the footsteps of Dr. Mays and become a professor. And he thinks of W.E.B. Du Bois, and he has this ambition that he may, instead of a pulpit, a lectern. Can you discuss like how from Morehouse College, the influences and his professional trajectory? You think of him as, you mentioned how he toyed around with being possibly a physician or a lawyer, and then possibly a minister. But then he's like, I would like to be a PhD and go into the academy. That's something, maybe be a pastor first. But explain like how he ended up at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, where he meets Rosa Parks. So explain like how we get there.
One reason that King didn't really want to be a preacher, or at least denied it for a while, is that he didn't want to be like his dad. Like so many of us, we may look up to our dads, but we also resist turning out too much like them. And his father was a very emotional preacher and a country preacher, really learned to pray, learned to preach before he learned how to read and write. And that embarrassed young Martin Luther King Jr. So when he gets to Morehouse and he sees someone like Benjamin Mays, who is a very different kind of a preacher and teacher, who combines the moral and the intellectual, who teaches in the classroom more than in the pulpit, that's when he begins to see, another path. He thinks maybe I can preach in a church for a little bit and then become a professor and then become, president of the university. When he's dating women and women ask him what he's going to be, he says, someday I'm going to be the president of Morehouse. And he has a little rap he says, Benjamin Mays can't live always. And that's the attitude that he takes when he takes his first job. He's going down, he applies for jobs all over the country, and he gets offers from Chattanooga and from Montgomery, the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And once again, his father's saying, don't take that church. That's an uppity church. That's highbrow people that they're not our type. But again, Martin Luther King Jr. is thinking he wants to be different. He wants to be classier. He wants to be, different kind of preacher than his father. And that job appeals to him. He does not go there looking to become the leader of a movement. In fact, after just less than a year there, he interviews for a job as the dean of the chapel at a Black school in New Orleans. So he's thinking already about, next steps. He's not looking to be a career preacher. And it's almost entirely by accident that he finds himself leading the Montgomery bus boycott. It just happens to be in the right place at the right time. And why this young man out of Boston by way of Atlanta, why is he chosen to stand up in front of the crowd and lead the boycott? It's really because he's new in town and he hasn't made any enemies yet. And they're worried that all the other potential candidates would be divisive figures, that some people would get behind him and some wouldn't. but King was a stranger to most folks. So they thought, throw him out there, let's see what happens. And, you know, he had a reputation for being a pretty good speaker. So that helped too. And that's really where he finds himself. That's when the course of his life changes dramatically, and any plans he had for replacing Benjamin Mays suddenly go out the window.
Outstanding narrative. It's really captivating to read that. One of the things I think is very important about that stage in Montgomery is the challenges that I assume he anticipated, the vitriol and the violence. Initially, he wanted to get a gun. He applied for a gun permit. His house was bombed. There were all sorts of death threats and terrible calls. He had calls to his house and his wife, and he had his first child, Yolanda. And the threats, and although he was committed to nonviolence, he fully understood and believed in the principle of self-defense and even armed self-defense. And that was not dislodged until later. But what's important here is that Coretta Scott King was so committed also to the cause of social justice that even after that house was bombed, can you tell us a little bit about how she reacted? And can you give us a little context to Coretta and what she brought to the table when they first met and he was at Boston University in graduate school?
Yeah, I'll back it up to Boston when they first meet, and then I'll bring you back to Montgomery. King is a popular guy. He dates a lot of women all through high school and college. And I was really intrigued, why Coretta? You know, there were women in Atlanta his family really wanted him to marry. He was unofficially engaged, whatever that means. He was engaged to a woman in Atlanta. He was dating lots of women in Boston. And yet he meets Coretta and declares on the first date that you're the one I'm going to marry. You're everything I've been looking for. And I think the answer to why, because there were, you know, she was beautiful and she was intelligent, of course, but so were other women he was dating. I think the real difference is that Coretta had a career as an activist. She had a resume. She had experience from Antioch, you know, an integrated school where she'd been involved in protests, where she'd been involved in political campaigns. And I think King Martin was really excited to meet a woman. He didn't have any experience at that point. He had not been involved in any activism work at that point in his life. So he says she had. Yeah. And when he starts bragging about how I'm going to go back down to the South and kill Jim Crow, she just kind of chuckles and says, yeah, tell me about it. How are you going to do that? Because she's been there. She's been involved in the struggle. And in fact, she had already met Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin had come to speak at her high school. So she had more connections in the movement than he did at that point too. And I think that plays a huge part throughout King's entire career. And when you look at Montgomery, you know, King is asked to make the inaugural speech to kick off the bus boycott. And he rushes home and tells Coretta, I don't know what I'm getting into here. They have a new baby. He's you know, still getting used to his new church. But Coretta immediately says, you know, I got your back. You know, if you want to do this, I'm with you all the way. And then soon after that, their house is dynamited. And you know, Coretta's home with the baby at the time. Martin is not. And both of their parents, you know, King's and Coretta's and Martin's parents come rushing to Montgomery and say, you're out of here. We're taking you home. This is too dangerous. And Coretta's the first one to say, we're not going anywhere. We are committed to this cause. And, you know, it's one thing for MLK to do it. His face is in the newspaper and he's, you know, standing up at the podium. It would be, you know, really difficult for him to back away. But for Coretta to say, I know I'm staying right here, you know, with you and with the baby, that's remarkable. And throughout his career, she's much more than just the strong wife, you know, staying home and supporting. She's a driving force who really affects his thinking and helps, you know, I think push him toward greater activism one step after another.
So the Montgomery bus boycott is legendary, and you give a lot of attention. You have an entire segment where you talk about how this affected the women of the movement, particularly Rosa Parks. And we all know about Rosa Parks. Many people here probably know that she was an activist for decades before December 1955. And she was a veteran who had been in communication with W.B. Du Bois and a whole bunch of other people around the NAACP and lynchings and the Scottsboro Boys case in the 1930s. But you mentioned how there's a certain point when Coretta steps in to help out Rosa Parks. And this is the interesting thing about the book, when you devote an entire section really to Coretta and just how she steps into the forefront of Vietnam War, protesting the Vietnam War. She speaks out international women's activism, and she steps out to actually help Rosa Parks, who had become economically precarious after the bus boycott. Can you talk a little bit more about how much she complemented King's activism and in many ways charted her own space?
I think it's really important, and then not just with Coretta, but for many of the women to recognize that their contributions were enormous and would have been even greater if not for the men leading the movement who were resistant to having women in positions of power. And that goes for Martin Luther King Jr. It's one of his real weaknesses, one of his real blind spots, is that he fails to recognize the contributions and the potential of women, including his own wife, including Ella Baker, including Septima Clark, on and on. And Rosa Parks too, after the bus boycott, she comes to feel neglected. The Montgomery Improvement Association won't offer her a paying job. Her husband is fired from his job as a repercussion for their involvement in the protests. So she hits on hard economic times, eventually leaves Montgomery, moves to Detroit, and still has some economic problems. And again, it's Coretta who sees a need and works to fill it. But the Montgomery bus boycott would not have happened. It's not just Rosa Parks, it's the women who had been preparing for years and negotiating with the city for years to try to integrate those buses. That movement was led entirely by women. And then it's only when it blows up and becomes a national cause celeb and becomes a headline that the men take over, and Martin Luther King emerges as the spokesman and leader of the group. And that's just because, and then I think, we have to say that sexism was compounded by the fact that the movement was led primarily by Southern Baptist preachers who came with an even greater sense of, greater biases than many in American society, just because of their background.
So the Montgomery bus boycott certainly catapults King into the national spotlight. And as you mentioned, the media attention initially is quite favorable. And he, by 1964, is admired, and many people think of him at, 1954 instead of 55. He's admired, 56. So the Montgomery bus boycott began December 55 into 66, 381 days. And then you have this national spotlight on this young minister from Alabama. He gets attention from the FBI. So J. Edgar Hoover early on sort of focuses on King, and at no point is he friendly with King. At no point does he like King. What was interesting in your narrative, and this is, I think, unique in many of the stories on King, is and his contempt for King is legendary, but you have an entire chapter 32 on the FBI. And what's also interesting is that the personalities and egos of the federal government were often in conflict with each other over King and having to do with King. But can you talk a little bit about the relationships, the pettiness, even in the highest reach of the government, and how to deal with Dr. King in particular, but the civil rights movement in general?
Yeah, it starts with a fundamental question. Why did our chief law enforcement officer, J. Edgar Hoover, become obsessed with Martin Luther King and focus so much of his energy on destroying a man who most of us would agree, even though he was controversial, was trying to improve our democracy? He was not a threat to democracy, but he was a threat to the white power structure. And Hoover recognizes this perhaps sooner and more clearly than anybody. It begins one day when Martin Luther King has the gall to criticize the FBI, saying that he's noticed that there aren't any Black agents working in the South. And while the white agents down there are supposed to be keeping the peace and protecting civil rights marchers from the Klan, in fact, most of those white FBI agents are in cahoots with the local police, who are in cahoots with the Klan in the first place. So when he says that, which is obviously true, J. Edgar Hoover blows a gasket. You do not criticize J. Edgar Hoover. He's very sensitive about any kind of criticism. And that's really the moment that he comes into Hoover's crosshairs. And it only gets worse, because then Hoover looks into it and sees that there are several former Communist Party members, in King's circles, and that gives Hoover the excuse, basically, to begin following King's activities, surveilling him. They begin wiretapping his phones. The phones of his associates. And when they do that, they quickly realize that he's not a communist, obviously, and that even when he's talking to some of these former members of the Communist Party, they're talking about how to, write legislation and how to get more people registered to vote. They're talking about the most bedrock American principles. But at the same time, he hears King on the phone with women other than Coretta, and this becomes his new obsession, because it's not about protecting America from communists. It's about protecting the white power structure from the change that the Black civil rights leaders would like to deliver. And Hoover just doubles down over and over and begins wiretapping King's hotel rooms and then spreading these reports that he's gathering so that presidents, congressional leaders, members of the media all know about this. So he's sullying King's reputation, hoping that one of these newspaper reporters will print it, and that King will be so embarrassed, so ashamed that perhaps his marriage will be destroyed, his position will be threatened, and that Hoover even makes plans to replace King with a civil rights leader of their own choosing, Samuel Pierce, who would go on to become the Secretary of HUD under Ronald Reagan.
So one of the things that is a fruit of the sort of campaign against King initiated by the FBI is the emotional distress that it takes an inordinate toll on King. And what comes through in your book is not just the psychological warfare waged against Dr. King, but also the criticism, the sort of incessant critique that he gets also from the African American community, elements of the African American community. Some are conservative ministers, like in 1966, 1965 in Chicago, Reverend Jackson, who was this minister's really big, well-known Black minister who's hostile to Dr. King. You also have in that same city, Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the largest Black nationalist organization in the country, the Nation of Islam. And they see King as a sort of pliant Uncle Tom, begging for scraps from white people's tables. And then before that, of course, the national spokesman for the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, who called him the good Reverend Dr. Chicken Wing. And I know you don't have that quote in the book, but this is what he calls him. And you have people in the civil rights movement, SNCC activists, who believe in nonviolence, who believe in integration, who believe in civil rights, who are fundamentally aligned with King, who also think that King is too tepid, that King doesn't go far enough, that he's not aggressive enough. You're members within the SCLC, his own organization, who believe that King, in some cases, demands too much and doesn't sort of delegate properly and is not doing right. There are people who are criticizing him for his take on Vietnam, and you go on this whole list of people. And it comes in your book just that he becomes depressed, it seems, by many estimates. Can you speak a little bit about the extent of the emotional toll, not just in a 1 year or a couple of years, but really the arc of his life, even before he becomes an activist? He seems to be doing some of those things, but they become more acute in his activist years. Can you speak to some of that?
Yeah, it was very important to me to write a book that humanizes King, in part because in celebrating him, we have sort of dulled his image and turned him into a postage stamp and a monument, and lost sight of the fact that he was a man, that he suffered, he had feelings, that he had doubts, that he had moments of insecurity, and even depression. He as a teenager, he twice attempted suicide, jumping out the second floor window of his home, which may suggest that he wasn't that determined, but because he only badly hurt himself, he didn't even break any bones. But all his life, he suffered emotionally. He was hospitalized numerous times for what he called exhaustion, but what Coretta sometimes referred to as depression. Even when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he got the news in the hospital. And he invited reporters to come and interview him about this great news while he was lying in bed, held a press conference in the hospital's theater, assembly room. So very complicated, and especially later in life when the FBI starts attacking him, when he's getting it from all sides, as you said. He's not liberal enough. He's not progressive enough for some Black leaders. He's too pushy for others. He's attacking white segregationists in the South, but when he points out that the racism in the North is just as bad, just better disguised, He risks losing his key supporters. He's constantly under duress and feels the strain of it. He says over and over again that, he needs to take some time off. He dreams of just having, a week of silence, just a retreat somewhere he can go and not have to speak to anybody, not have to deal with any problems. And he never gets that kind of a break. Even when he takes a vacation, he's still using it to work, writing a book or preparing for a speech. And, your heart really goes out to him. You see how much he's struggling. And, toward the end, it's really bad. We have these wiretaps of the conversations because the FBI is bugging his phones. And we can hear how desperate he is for some kind of an escape. And we can hear his friends, because we have those phone calls too, talking amongst themselves. What are we going to do? He can't go on this way much longer. And your heart just breaks for him. And it's important to realize. I think it makes him more courageous when we realize that he was suffering for what he believed in.
What is really powerful when you say that your heart breaks for someone who believes in such possibilities for moral advancement, right, in society. And even with all the hatred, and when many people are sort of throwing their hands up in white America and saying that white Americans cannot be reformed, he reminds people about the humanity. And he would often say that, white people are committed to see the Negro free as Negroes ought to free themselves. And so he hammers home that there's a really what Christians call grace, and that people can be reformed at all stages. And you see this moral conflict. But Dr. King does evolve and on different issues over time. And to go back to that, when you mentioned the bombing of his house in Montgomery, and he went out to get a gun permit. Can you discuss the stages of his evolutionary arc? And it's a fascinating one, because I think a lot of people think that we have this prepackaged king who just pops up, like, and these Gandhian notions of nonviolence,
right,
and integration and humanity. But there's a king that actually is a work in progress from the time he first leads a ministry to April 4th, 1968. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution of things?
Yeah, absolutely. It begins with the issue of nonviolence. That's one of the first ways that you start to see the evolution, because, as you said, he gets a gun after his house is bombed. And Bayard Rustin, lots of people, when King emerges as the leader in Montgomery, come to Montgomery hoping that they can work with him, that they can somehow channel his energies, that they can take advantage of this arrival of this new messenger and get him to speak out on other issues, think about how they can make this movement go national. And Bayard Rustin is one of the first ones to arrive. Rustin is a very experienced organizer and a very progressive thinker. And one of the first things, and he's also a Quaker and believes in nonviolence, and has studied Gandhi, and says to King, if you're going to try this nonviolence thing, you might want to lose the gun, and you might want to.
Yeah. What kind of gun did King have?
It was a handgun of some kind. I don't remember exactly. Just a small. I think it was a small gun. I don't know if it was a revolver, but he applied for a permit and was denied by the state. Even though there's no reason why he should have been denied a permit, but he was, because of racism, obviously. But we start to see him embracing it first as a tactic, really, and it becomes more of a way of life over time. At first, he just sees the moral advantage that it plays well in the press for the movement to be nonviolent, for King to have this moral high ground, saying that we will take your attacks, we will take your abuse, and we will not strike back. We will show you our love, and with our love we will redeem you, and it sends this incredibly powerful message, and it gets to the point where King really does begin to embody that spirit. There's a time in Birmingham where a guy gets up out of the crowd while King's speaking and punches King in the face several times. And when police take the man into custody, King says, "No, let him go." And King goes and speaks to him. And it turns out the man's a member of the Nazi party. And King invites him to come back and to listen to the rest of his speech. And Septa McClark, who was there, said, "That was the moment that I knew that this nonviolent stuff was not just a strategy. This is his philosophy. This is what he really believed." And Coretta said to him afterwards, "Well, I wish you hadn't done that. What if he had a gun?" And King said, "Well, if he had a gun, he probably would have used it the first time." But that's that's just one way in which he began to evolve. But we also see over the long course of his career, his evolution where he refuses to be confined to the issue of civil rights and begins to feel it's his responsibility to speak out on everything the Bible compels him to speak out on materialism, on militarism, on hunger, on poverty. And he begins to, certainly in the last years of his life, begins to talk about shifting from civil rights to human rights. And that's a big part of his evolution too. And I think Coretta is another force in guiding that, because it's Coretta, when he wins the Nobel Prize, who says, we now have a broader sense of responsibility. We have other issues we have to focus on now. I think that really is very important to King.
So there's an interview that he has in around 1966 or 7. And the interviewer asked if he has become closer to Malcolm X. And a lot of people have argued that, and you touched that your focus is of course on King, but you do give some attention to Malcolm X, who in the early 1960s was, for a moment, the most interviewed Black person in the United States. And while he didn't have nearly the sort of following that Martin King had, was a significant player in racial politics across and eventually globally. But as you note, when he leaves the Nation of Islam, he becomes much more moderate on the issue of race, and he ceases to believe that whites are biologically evil, and he ceases to think that Black nationalism is the panacea for the Black folks' struggles. But he is always a radical, and he starts to critique capitalism, and he does some other things. But I know you've written on Muhammad Ali, so I know you know about the Nation of Islam. King, and I'm assuming you know a lot about Malcolm X, so I'm kind of going off a little bit here. A lot of people have talked about them becoming ideologically closer as they both near death, right? And so King, of course, would live 3 more years than Malcolm, but Malcolm in February of 65 and King in April of 68. What would you think about these two figures who were ideologically dynamic, and that evolution at that point, and the degree to which they might, in fact, have some common ground?
Yeah, so much of their adversarial relationship was concocted and first by Malcolm, because he knew it was good for him. He knew it was good to position himself as the radical alternative to King, and that would speak really well to his audiences, who were younger and more frustrated, and mostly in the North. And I think that it also played well because the Nation of Islam was not a part of the civil rights movement at all, and wanted no part of the move for integration. So it helped Malcolm to brand himself, really, in a way, by contrasting his positions with Martin Luther King. But it's worth noting that when Malcolm was in Alabama once and went to try to see King in Selma, and found that King was in jail, he spoke to Coretta and said, "Tell Dr. King that I know what I'm doing, that maybe people will be more inclined to deal with him if they know I'm the alternative." So a lot of it was also manufactured by the media to try to set them up as radicals, as rivals, because in fact, what their ultimate cause was Black dignity, was Black rights, was Black justice, and they agreed on that. And James Baldwin said that by the end of their lives, their views were fairly indistinguishable. But it was hard to see that sometimes, because Malcolm was taking advantage of the positioning himself in opposition, and then the white media in particular was really fueling that. And one of the things I discovered was that that Martin Luther King's interview with Playboy, in which he criticized Malcolm, that quote was invented by Alex Haley. In fact, Martin Luther King in that interview said, "I don't believe I have all the answers. I don't like when Malcolm calls for violence, but I think that we share a lot of similar views." So I think that had they both lived, it's always hard to predict, but it certainly seemed like they were finding more in common as they went along.
Yeah. So I know that he did get a chance to meet with Malcolm briefly. He also met with Elijah Muhammad briefly, and Muhammad Ali briefly. Can you talk about those 3 meetings? Because these are sort of 3 Black nationalists, and Malcolm was still, I think at that point, Malcolm was still in the Nation of Islam, perhaps on his way out. But can you talk about those 3 brief meetings?
Yeah, first with Malcolm, they met only for a couple of minutes, maybe not even a full minute on Capitol Hill when they were both there lobbying for legislation, which tells you a lot about where Malcolm was in his evolution, that he would even bother going to Congress and speaking on behalf of legislation. This guy who had positioned himself as a political outsider for so long, but they barely had time to connect. And King said afterwards he regretted that they didn't have more time to speak. And then with Elijah Muhammad, Martin Luther King was almost always willing to listen to people he disagreed with. He really seemed to enjoy debating with people like Stokely Carmichael, but he did not seem to enjoy Elijah Muhammad. And in fact, after meeting him, Elijah Muhammad wrote a letter inviting King to come back and to speak at an assembly for the Nation of Islam, and King just blew it off. Like, he was clearly not looking to build a relationship there, but we don't really know why. He never commented on what he really thought about Elijah Muhammad. But my favorite meeting of all of those is the meetings between Muhammad Ali and Martin Luther King, because there's great video footage of King. King and Ali are both in Louisville, which is Muhammad Ali's hometown, and there's a protest for fair housing. And even though Ali was at least ostensibly opposed to integration, he attended the fair housing rally and stood beside King, and TV cameras were rolling. And Ali just keeps interrupting Martin Luther King. Like, who interrupts Martin Luther King? And King is just cracking up every time Ali opens his mouth. You don't get to see King laugh too much in public. He's a funny guy with a great sense of humor, but he's always keeping it under control when he's in public, because he knows he has to convey this serious sort of presidential manner. But he can't help himself. Ali just cracks him up every time. It's beautiful.
I think that the humanity of King definitely comes through, and sort of the highs and lows and everything in between, and how he grapples with so much. It's interesting source, the end of his life, he becomes more outspoken about the war in Vietnam, and he has this contentious relationship. I don't know if it's entirely contentious, but he has a relationship with LBJ that becomes increasingly strained over Vietnam. And there's so much that he appreciates about LBJ's legislative agenda for obvious reasons, war and poverty. But despite the outcry from mainstream white newspapers, our own congressman, our own senator here in the state of Connecticut, Thomas Dodd, as well as people who are very close to him in the civil rights movement, telling him, imploring that he not speak out about Vietnam, or that he stay in his lane because he's ill-equipped to talk about issues beyond the United States. He persists, and even as it seems to me, if you could talk a little bit about how Dr. King, even when he's confronted with so much vitriol from so many corners, he doesn't, even though it strains him and he's distressed, he only sleeps 2 to 3 hours a night, and he has fatigue, he's hospitalized, he doesn't relent. And he, in fact, he leans in back, right? So he leans into his opposition to the war. Talk about that. He seems to be cut from a different cloth. I mean, most people under that sort of onslaught, right? The lack of support from so many corners, and the fatigue and the extent. What makes King so different? I mean, you might not be able to answer that, but explain this process here.
This is one of the things I love about the man the most. There's so many opportunities when he easily could have stepped back and said, I'm not really the most effective guy for this anymore. I'm getting it from all sides. I believe what I believe about the Vietnam War, but it's not worth it. Like the movement would be better off without me at this point, because I'm into other things, or I need a break. I'm going to go teach. I'm going to take a year off and write a book. Even people within his closest allies are saying, you're really hurting yourself. You're hurting the movement by taking on all these other causes. If you would just stick to voting rights, we could really go to town. Just stick to what you're good at. We're really successful when the white media from the North comes down and writes about our efforts in Birmingham and in Selma. We're getting lots of support. We're getting more funds flowing in. We're affecting policy. If we just keep doing that, we'll get more people registered to vote. We'll change the balance of power everywhere from the city hall to the state houses to the Congress of the United States. We'll change presidential elections. Just keep doing that. And King can't do it. he says, I believe that the war in Vietnam is wrong. I can't call out violence. I can't say that I'm a pacifist. I can't attack the rioting, the violent rebellions in Los Angeles and criticize that while allowing the US government to perpetrate the greatest violence on earth in Vietnam. I just can't be silent because that's what I believe. That's not about what's the most practical political choice. It's about who I am and what where I come from. And he's thinking morally. He's not thinking politically. And I think people like LBJ can't even begin to wrap their heads around that. Why won't he listen to reason? Why won't he dump the communists in his circle? Why won't he stop criticizing the Vietnam War when he knows it's sabotaging his relationship with the president? He's losing access to the White House. All he has to do is shut up and he can be back in our good graces. They can't understand that King is not thinking like a Machiavellian. He's thinking like a follower of Jesus, and that's what makes him heroic, because so few people will live up to their core beliefs when push comes to shove. And man, it was a lot of pushing and a lot of shoving on him.
And of course, he was called an Uncle Tom by spaces. He was called too radical. He lost a lot of friends. Most Americans, actually, polls will show, became critical of the Vietnam War, and they lost support for the Vietnam War shortly after King's assassination.
Yeah.
So most Americans caught up to Dr. King in so many ways. They were talking about integration, voting rights, civil rights, the war in Vietnam. And he was really ahead of the moral curve in so many fronts. And it's amazing to see just how much he dealt with in that process, but again, did not relent.
Yeah, but as you said in your introduction, he's become this almost universally beloved figure. And we see the same thing happen with Muhammad Ali. We only find that it's easier to love him when we forget how radical he really was. The Ali we love, the Ali who everybody fell in love with, is the one who lit the torch in the Olympics because he couldn't speak anymore. So he couldn't tell us just how badly we were behaving, how racist we still were. And we fall in love with the Martin Luther King, who says, I have a dream, and let's judge people by the content of their character. And we forget that 5 minutes earlier in that same speech at the March on Washington, he called out police brutality, and he called out economic inequality, and he talked about reparations. So we're choosing the safe version of these heroes, and not the radical version that really made them important in the first place.
There's a considerable degree of cherry picking when it comes to both historical figures. You're right.
Yes, especially King these days, because everybody can cherry pick a quote that they can find to use to support almost any cause, including those who are opposed to affirmative action, those who are opposed to support for the poor, for the hungry. They'll say King wanted us to be judged, wanted us to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, he's being abused in many ways.
Yeah. I mean, I think if I recall correctly, Herschel Walker was also misquoting King and saying that King would support the stuff that John Lewis was talking about, and would support the stuff that Abrams and Raphael Warnock. It's really kind of amazing to see the degree to which people will sort of misquote and use King for so many different things. So you wrote a book on Ali, and so my last question before we get to the Ali question and why Dr. King is, we talk about his protests over the Vietnam War, and on the eve of his death, when you think about the radicalism of King, not only is he at this point, and April 3rd, in 1968, we have Civil Rights Bill was passed, which is monumental, public accommodation, 1964. Voting Rights Act was passed August of 65, which is, of course, important. Black Power emerges in June of 66 the next year. You have more radical expressions emerging among African Americans everywhere. People are pushing against the Vietnam War. You have people protesting in the streets. You have all these things going on. And King, of course, is in the middle of this vortex in so many ways. The successes, but also the tensions over not going far enough. And King demands, in fact, that there be economic justice. As you say, he becomes more critical of capitalism. We see King also, though, with all that stress, with everything you mentioned before, more eloquently than I can say, about just how much he carried the weight, the burden of all these things, that he still leaned in and demanded sort of moral demands. He made those moral demands amplified on the eve of his death. But what's important, which is spooky, or one might say, those of us who are more spiritually inclined might say that he had a sense that God had spoken to him and that his mission had carried him this far. And he was aware that he was now at the end of this road, that he was ready to be released. And that redemptive power of his commitment to civil rights, right? And all the suffering he went through was in many ways Christ-like. He seemed to intimate that his suffering was redemptive for a greater good, much in the way that Christ suffered for us. Not that he thought himself to be divine or perfect, but he thought himself to fundamentally be walking the steps of Christ as a good Christian could, but the footsteps will never be perfect, right? But at the eve of his death, there he is. He seems to talk about this, not just publicly, but also privately. Can you talk about just like in the days, not just the months leading into that, but just talk about the days. You talk about this in your book very eloquently, how he seemed to be aware that death was around the corner for him.
Well, a lot of his friends thought that he was depressed and that he was becoming morbid, that he didn't see a future. But, that may be, revisionist thinking, because they know that he was assassinated, and that it's, we can look back on it and say this was a dark moment for him. I think, he accepted early on that God had spoken to him and that this was his mission, and that he needed to sacrifice his life for this. And he before he died, he felt like he had already committed himself fully, and that whatever happened, that he had been called and he would answer that call, and that he was obviously ready to die because he'd been stabbed in the chest and shot at and was getting death threats, more than weekly. So it's not unrealistic, or it's not shocking that he would stand up in front of that crowd in Memphis and say, I've seen the mountaintop and I may not get there with you. It's just part of the journey he'd been on. So did he, see his own death? No, I don't think so. I think he saw that he had already given his life to this cause, and that it didn't really matter how long he lived, but that there were signs that he was struggling. But when I spoke to Andy Young about that, he said that, yeah, King was down and he was feeling frustrated, but he was also getting ready to launch what he hoped, might be a long shot, but a true attempt to shake up the nation and to force it to reconsider not just civil rights, but human rights, and to look at poverty and welfare and hunger. And he wanted to, basically occupy Washington, D.C. with this Poor People's Campaign, and that he was not giving up. And, had he lived, he might have suffered, he might have gone through some very dark times, but he was never going to give up. And that's the dedication he made. It wasn't that he, recognized that he was going to die a young man. It was that he'd already just decided that, this was what he was dedicating his life to.
That's really a great observation here. So for you, you wrote this fabulous book here. You also wrote a fantastic book on Muhammad Ali and two iconic figures. Why King? Given that we know so much about King, so much has been written about King, but this has been, by many estimations, the first sort of definitive biography of King in the generation. But why King?
I felt like it was the most important story I could possibly tell, given my limited skills and my access. And when I was working on Ali, I had access to folks like Dick Gregory and Harry Belafonte and Andy Young. And I recognized that these are people who knew King intimately, and that we had lost sight of him. We had lost sight of any kind of an intimate view of him. We turned him into a national monument and forgotten that he was human. And there was an opportunity to talk to people who knew him and to write a new book that would reintroduce people and maybe undo a little bit of the damage that the holiday had done in watering down that image. And also, it had been at that point 35, now it's 40 years since the previous King biography. And, we need a new biography of King every, at least every 10, 20 years, because the world is changing and we see him differently, and we need different things from him at different times. If you look at what we're living through now, we still need King's voice. His image, his message seems so modern. It seems so relevant to what we're living through now. And, I started writing this book in 2016. Think about what was going on in this country at that time. Think about Charlottesville. Think about the immigration policies of the president. Think about George Floyd. All of that was going on as I was writing this book. So I felt like I needed King's voice, and I'm hoping that other people will benefit from hearing that voice again too.
So historians have the language we use about they used to use the word great man, like a history of great man, but it's like great men and women. The degrees to which history makes great people, or people make great history. And I think that many of us, we think of this quote that King often made, which came from someone else: the arc of the universe is long, but bends towards justice. If King had accepted that position at Dillard University as dean of the chapel, and he became the professor that he wants to be, and followed in the footsteps of someone like W.E.B. Du Bois or Dr. Mays, in a counterfactual world, and it's difficult. This is all conjecture and fun.
Yeah.
Right? What do you think would have happened when you think about the last 60 years, 65 years, right? From 55 up. Montgomery boycott happened, right? Rosa Parks was already there. The other Abernathy was there. You have some people who are already there. Boycott happens. You don't have this 26-year-old charismatic, brilliant young pastor. You don't have Selma with King at the helm. You don't have all these other things. What was a counterfactual world, the unfolding of events in the United States look like without sort of moral bellwether of someone like that? Because King is unique, right? There's no one like him, and he there's so much in that package.
Yeah.
So what do you think the United States, how do you think we would look like in 2023 without Dr. King?
You're setting me up for an impossible question there, but I'll
yeah, man, this is fun stuff though, man. You gotta
then I might turn it back on you and see what you say. But so let's say Ralph Abernathy is leading the bus boycott. He's not as telegenic. He's not as brilliant a speaker. He's a fearless leader and a great preacher, and he rallies the local community. But nobody comes in and says, "Hey, Dr. Abernathy, you got to take this national because you're a star and your voice is ringing out across the land." That doesn't happen. So maybe the NAACP continues to be the most effective group for a while longer, and it works through the courts, but we don't have that moral visionary who's challenging us, challenging white liberals, challenging moderates in the South, challenging people to go down and start volunteering for voter registration. You don't have that voice echoing from the national, from the Lincoln Memorial. You just don't have that crystallization and that moral inspiration, because King said over and over again, at heart, I'm a preacher. And he was preaching to the nation to save the soul of the nation. And I don't think you get anybody who's big enough, bold enough, and beautiful enough, visionary and speaker to really appeal to the soul of the nation the way he does. So it's just going to go differently, but I don't know how much more slowly it goes or where it leads. That's the fun part. Maybe Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam emerge as more powerful figures. Maybe we wait and we end up seeing more Black people elected to office, and that becomes the primary route through that we see change making. I don't know. What would you say if I asked you that question?
I've never actually considered it before, but just as I asked you this question, I had to ponder myself. And I think that Thurgood Marshall, as you noted here, said that too much attention was given to King over the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, when it was actually won in the courts, that the whites on the ground were no more willing to compromise than they were when the boycott began, and they were as recalcitrant and obstinate. If you go up to 1966 in Chicago, when King is confronted with that degree, actually before that, when they're marching in Mississippi, 11 years after the Montgomery bus boycott begins, and they're after the murders of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, and he's talking, and there are sheriffs who are like, and he says, I think one of the murderers might be in this crowd, and the sheriff's like, yeah, you're right, and you have people who
you're next.
Morally, they're just as immoral as they were before.
Right.
Nothing's changed. They're just as vicious.
Yeah.
And when he goes to Chicago, in a place where there are no de jure laws for racial oppression, but the de facto policies are there. I mean, there are some de jure laws with housing and such, but no segregation in schools in the same explicit way. The he's confronted with a degree of violence that he had never seen even in the Deep South, and there are marchers, as you know, there are marchers who say that they were out and they saw throngs of people. Usually in the South, you had men who were out cheering and attacking and throwing stuff, but you had whole families, grandmothers, little kids and stuff. You had all these 10,000 people in Cicero and Marquette Park. And so it was just really an extraordinary level of violence and hatred that he saw. This is after the Voting Rights Act was passed, right? So I think if you didn't have King as a sort of person who had always pushed for nonviolence, but philosophically racial reconciliation, and an explicit call for peace, an explicit call for the leaning into the humanity of all people, right? Saying that while there are some vicious, horrible, racist whites out there, that there are people like Viola Luiso and other whites who are committed to, who've given their lives, Cheney and Schwerner, right? Or Goodman and Schwerner, of the two whites who were killed in '64 in Mississippi. And there were other whites who were beaten and such. But the NAACP by nature was not, their design was not to talk about morality and ethics in that way, right? And I think that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, founded in 1960, may not have been founded had the SCLC not been founded. I'm not sure that would have been a thing. So I think there would have been a vacuum unless someone else would have come about, we don't know, who might have had the requisite oratory skills to sort of, I mean, King really was the package. I mean, his wife, his kids, his impeccable pedigree in terms of background, his education, his brilliance, the extent to which he could communicate to people in different spaces when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, or he's playing pool in some backwoods spot in the south side of Chicago. So he had skills that, and he had a sort of a package that just is incredibly rare. But I think most importantly, the organizational development and evolution would not have occurred without him. I think that CORE, James Farmer, didn't have it, although they were committed to nonviolence. So what I think this would have happened was, had King gone into the academia and been this dean at this school or become a president of a college, he may have written about these issues like other intellectuals may have written about them. The moral crusade would not have occurred. And I do think that hate that people saw in whatever activist spaces, I think that there are a lot of people who gravitate to the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X. I mean, there's no way you get around the fact that the Nation of Islam was the fastest growing Black organization in the United States in the 1960s. It became the richest Black organization in the United States. Malcolm X was, again, as I said, he was interviewed, he got 21 gun salutes when he left the Nation of Islam and went across Africa. I think that racial discord would have been a lot more violent. And I think that there wouldn't have been one to say, hey, let's look at the humanity of the good white people out here. Let's be peaceful. Let's take the moral high ground. I think that it would have been a lot more violent. And I think that there would have been progress, but I think it would have come at the expense of a lot of civil unrest, much more than what we saw.
That's very interesting.
I think ultimately the laws have been removed, but I will end on this and to answer your question here. I talked to a colleague about South Africa and the end of apartheid, 1994 with open elections, and he told the story of a beach that was segregated in some place in South Africa, and the local police, all white, like boars, they would, if someone came over, they would beat them, they would chase them down, they would arrest them, they were just savages. And once the laws came down and anyone could go to the beach, those same police officers were there and they would give people directions with politeness and say, well, you go here, you go there. They immediately adjusted. And you mentioned in your book how Jim Clark, who was this horrible sheriff who brutalized people in Alabama, that once Black people got the right to vote, he campaigned to Black people and said, hey, vote for me. I'll give you barbecue. I'm Jim Clark. I'm a good guy. Yeah. And so I think that there may have been those quick adjustments. And as you and I know, people all across the United States, Black and white and all sorts of different races, can be at the same hotel and restaurant and not feel they have to dynamite the place because, Black people are here or some Asian are here, So I kind of think that laws, this sounds bizarre. I think laws can kind of change people in ways as well. And So, but it would have been much more violent. It's real convoluted. But I think we may be out of time here. I was looking.
Well,
to see-
that went by fast. That was such
Yes,
a
it
good
went by very
conversation.
fast. I was looking to see if we had any kind of questions in the chat. I see that we
I think we just blew right through them if we did.
yeah. You can certainly buy the book. Here's Omar Acevedo put a link here for us where you can purchase the book. You can click on this in your chat. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I
wonderful.
enjoyed it. Let's do it
Yeah,
again.
I wish you were
sometime.
here in person. You know, I want to congratulate
Next time.
you. Sign my book. Yep. So if I ever see you out in the street somewhere, you can sign my book if I have it in my backpack. It was
All
great
right.
meeting you. And congratulations. It's a fantastic piece of work.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for showing up. Thank you.